1. Stan Breckshire's right shoulder throbbed. The pain crept up his neck to the base of his skull and all the way down to his fingers. Great. His pinched nerve was cheerleading another touchdown, and the game hadn't even begun. Rah, rah, pre-trial stress. Let's give Stan another mess. In the prosecutor's seat behind the counsel table, Stan held his arm out from his side, rotating it at the elbow. Then he rubbed the pressure point in his neck. Not even through with jury selection yet, and just look at him. Today's panel of potential jurors had been the lousiest he'd ever seen, and apparently the worst was yet to come in the search for the second and final alternate. The courtroom door opened behind Stan. He resisted the urge to look back, although both defense attorneys did so. With such pleasant faces, he might add. Stan worked to keep his own expression as pleasant as possible. He was well aware of the 12 jury members and first alternate already seated in the jury box, watching the attorney's moves with morbid curiosity. "Come on in, folks," Judge Carol Chanson greeted the last 2 stragglers as a bailiff led them in. "I know it's been a long day for you. If you'll have a seat at the end of the first row in the jury box, I'll explain how we might need you." Stan's eyes darted to the 2 people taking their seats. One very impatient-looking man, and a knockout of a woman in her mid-30s, shoulder-length, cinnamon-colored hair and matching eyes, clear skin and a trim figure, well fitted into an expensive-looking green silk shirt and off-white belted pants. She fairly oozed grace and intelligence. Stan's heart sank. Chelsea Adams looked even worse than he'd imagined. Quickly he shuffled papers before him, anything to keep from staring at her. He wondered if T.C., as he privately called lead defense attorney Terence Clyde, or his sidekick, Erica Salvador, had any hint of who this woman was. As fate would have it, the defense shared the same sinking boat with Stan. They'd used the last of their peremptory challenges allotted for alternates. Stan almost smirked. Nice little irony to their demanding a change of venue. Monterey County had its share of eccentrics, but it would have had to work mighty hard to spit out a sample like the likes of this woman. Knowing T.C., he'd probably use one of the minions on his fat payroll to run a check on the names of summoned people as soon as the attorneys received their lists that morning. All by his lonesome, Stan had wheedled help from a gum-snapping secretary in the district attorney's office. With rolling eyes, she'd finally agreed to check his list against the criminal clerk's records, finding out which people had previously served on a jury. But of course, that's not how he'd heard the stuff on Chelsea Adams. Rather, it was the "I know something you don't know" look on the face of some deputy DA he'd run into during break just 15 minutes ago. Someone in county records had noticed an infamous name on the list and had said something to her co-worker, who'd said something to someone else, who'd run into said deputy DA during lunch hour. As in every county, gossip was alive and well within the courthouse walls. Stan had heard an earful and re-entered the courtroom with rising panic. Stan rubbed his arm, wincing. So what? At the very worst, the woman would only be second and final alternate if she got past his questioning at all, which she wouldn't. Judge Chanson slid on her gold-rimmed reading glasses and, for the benefit of the newly arrived, began to read the complaint against the defendant. That in the People v. Welk, Darren Wayne Welk was charged with second-degree murder under Penal Code Section 187 yada yada. Stan forced his eyes to the judge, barely hearing her words. Not that he needed to. He'd heard them at least 24 times since that morning, every time a new batch of potential jurors had entered the courtroom. "Okay." Judge Chanson exchanged one paper for another, her glasses still perched on her nose. The ends were attached to a purple chain around her ample neck. Her salt-and-pepper hair was cut short, leaving nothing to frame her double chin. "First we have Greg Seacombe. Mr. Breckshire?" "You're my boy, Greg," thought Stan as he pushed back from the table, automatically pulling his tie. He hustled to the podium that faced the jury, making eye contact with Mr. Seacombe. "Good afternoon." The guy looked almost too good to be true. A yuppie white businessman, every prosecutor's dream. Brown hair perfectly coiffed, the drawn, beleaguered face of stressful success, and a designer suit, right down to the magenta power tie. Stan knew that yuppies tended to fear crime, be fiercely protective of their property, and usually hadn't suffered enough to be sympathetic to some defendant. Unfortunately, the man also brimmed with impatience, obviously not happy at missing a full day at the office. Stan opened his mouth to begin questioning, hoping against hope that Seacombe wouldn't claim work hardship. "Your Honor, I have a real problem with staying." Seacombe addressed the judge as if Stan weren't there. "Since I received my summons, things have now changed at my startup software company, and I'm the only one there who can—" Uh-oh, too late for a sob story. It was the end of the day, and everyone was tired. Besides, these two were it for the panel. No one wanted to wait for another group to be called. "Let's talk about this, Mr. Seacombe." Stan pushed in before the judge could reply. "Court usually ends around 5 o'clock, and this case is only expected to take about 2 weeks. Can you manage to work in the evenings just for that long?" "No way. That's not enough time," the man replied, as if the mere thought were ludicrous. "Well, is there a co-worker who can fill in for you?" "No. As I said, I'm the only one who knows how to run the place." "And the staff can't do without you for just a few days? Surely you have a cell phone. You could check in during breaks." Seacombe's face compressed. "I can't run the office from a courtroom. We're right in the middle of some very important projects, and I have to be there all day." "Could you possibly—" "Mr. Seacombe," Judge Chanson cut in, her tone betraying impatience. She leaned forward, puffing herself out over her cherrywood desk as if to intimidate Mr. Irreplaceable with her very size. "I know this is a difficult time for you, but jury duty is what it says, a duty that should be fulfilled if at all possible. I understand that, but for me it isn't possible, not at this time." Greg Seacombe began ticking off manicured fingers like a scolding young parent. "First of all, we've run into problems with the software program we were supposed to launch last week. Every day we take to fix those problems, we lose an estimated $267,000. Second, another program—" Stan Breckshire hung onto the podium, right arm throbbing, as Greg Seacombe fired every shot from his company's heavy artillery. The man started quoting numbers right and left, amounts of dollars his company would lose on this project and that one, all with multiple zeros. And of course, they weren't just his dollars. They were the investors' dollars, blather, blather. His boy or not, Stan wanted to wrap his hands around the man's starch-collared neck and choke him silly. "All right, Mr. Seacombe," the judge intoned, pulling off her glasses. "We get the picture." She sat back in her large black leather chair with a sigh. "Mr. Clyde, anything you want to add here?" "Well, Your Honor," T.C. said without rising, his baritone voice oozing empathy, "I think we should let Mr. Seacombe go. Clearly he has a work hardship issue that simply cannot be overcome." Well, thought Stan, there was his answer. T.C. hadn't a clue who Chelsea Adams was. "I'm not so convinced of that." The judge fingered the chain on her glasses, eyeing Greg Seacombe. "A company of this apparent size is certainly maintained by more than one person. I don't even see why this defendant needs a trial," Seacombe growled suddenly, casting a purposeful glance at the jurors down his row. "He's obviously guilty." "Your Honor," T.C. protested, half rising from his seat. He shook his gray, craggy head at the judge as if to say, "What more do you need?" Judge Chanson narrowed hard eyes at Seacombe. Her wide jaw set, and her chest swelled with air. Stan cringed. Seacombe's gig was obvious enough, but Stan knew the judge couldn't give him a chance for further prejudicial statements in the presence of the jury, even if the other members were giving him looks of pure derision. Seacombe stared back at the judge with a spit in the Constitution's eye. Stan could have punched the guy. He hoped Greg Seacombe's software company bit the dust and gagged on it. Judge Chanson arched back in her chair, still staring daggers. "You are excused, Mr. Seacombe." Her words were clipped. Seacombe darted from his seat, slithered past the knees of Chelsea Adams, and made for the door. Judge Chanson lodged her glasses on her nose just so and busied herself with papers, her eyes flicking up to aim one last knife at Mr. Yuppie's fast-departing back. The courtroom door closed. The judge took a cleansing breath. "All right," she announced tiredly, then checked her list. "Chelsea Adams." Stan Breckshire's heart fell to his toes. Greg Seacombe's trail still slimed the courtroom floor, and now he needed to convince Judge Chanson to excuse the last juror for cause. No problem, Stan rallied himself. He'd produce enough cause, all right. "Good afternoon, Miss Adams." Stan bobbed his head, lips pulling back for a brief moment. The faces of his peers back in Monterey County flashed like neon before him. He could just imagine their head shaking upon hearing he'd let this babe on his jury. Could just hear his nemesis Harry Kent blabbing it up, feigned sympathy on his face and a jingle in his step. And Stan wouldn't be around to defend himself. Well, no matter, because he wasn't about to let that happen. No way, no how. Whatever it took, Stan Breckshire was going to get the religious lunatic named Chelsea Adams out of his jury box.